that is a 3-mana play. And that's a lot of what we're going to be seeing from Syed throughout the legacy portion of this event, is having the strongest 3-mana plays in the field, and then the best cards to enable 3-mana plays.
So what Zan does that turn, he starts on Arkham's Astrolabe, but didn't have a 3-mana play ready. He drew a card here, and then just made the second land and passed. Now, deck lists are open for this event, so we go over to Joe. You see that copy of Teferi Time Raveler in his hand. When we look at the counterspells in Zan's deck, he has 3 copies of Force of Will, and that's it.
Yeah, past that, it looks like most of what he's trying to do is just kind of dominate the battlefield and proactively answer things that people are doing with cards like Oko, with cards like Abrupt Decay.
Yeah, it's actually really interesting, right? When he doesn't have cards like Spell Pierce in his deck, and Joe knows that, normally running out a Teferi into this board would be a risk that Joe would have to take. But there actually isn't any risk here. If Zan Force of Wills it, that's a 2-for-1 in Joe's favor. Otherwise, it's going to work. I mean, Zan's removal is Abrupt Decay and Assassin's Trophy, which doesn't work end step at taking care of Teferi.
Right, and, you know, this is a spot where this is Lossett saying, all right, even if you have a Force of Will, it's going to take 2 cards out of your hand, which could kind of be a big deal for any mid-range deck in a sort of slog like this one.
Joe plays the Time Raveler. He actually has some counterspell backup of his own. It looks like a Force of Negation in his hand.
And this is insurance against something like Oko, Thief of the Crowns, coming down next turn.
Right. Yeah, if Zan forces here, I'm not sure that Joe forces back.
Right, just having Teferi Time Raveler being a sort of Hymn to Torok is good enough.
Yeah. Yeah, you'd hate to force it through, then Zan untaps, makes Oko, Astrolabe attacks Teferi.
Right.
And on Syed's side, it looks like it's just going to be Brainstorm. Now he has to get this cast before Teferi enters the battlefield. It's an instant.
And Teferi creates a situation where Lossett doesn't necessarily know if this means that Zan even wants to answer the Teferi, or if he just wants to be mana efficient and cast his Brainstorm at this point.
Be interesting to see how this board plays, as it looks like Teferi will resolve. In a lot of the blue mirrors, this Teferi can really be a trump card, because suddenly you win all the counter wars. Now, Zan doesn't really play much counter magic, so Teferi's not going to do that.
Right, the way that Syed fights a counter war is just casting must counter spell after must counter spell.
Yeah. Get a look now at Joe's hand. It is land 4, Force of Negation, Dovin's Veto, Brainstorm, and Supreme Verdict.
And Joe has a choice here between bouncing the goose and bouncing the food to actually just shut Syed down from having that extra mana next turn. And it looks like he chose to target the food, which opened Syed to actually sacrifice the food in response, so Lossett doesn't get to draw a card.
Yeah, I'm actually surprised to have seen that play happen.
Yeah, the idea here is Lossett just doesn't want Syed to generate extra material in the battlefield when recasting the goose, because that's going to make later copies of things like Oko even stronger.
Yeah, so willing to give away a card to accomplish that, or do you think this might have been a misstep on Joe's side?
I think here it's just Lossett saying if he gets to untap with Dovin's Veto and Force of Negation and a Planeswalker, he's going to feel pretty comfortable. So he's just doing whatever he can to play a, say, 10-turn game, and this is going to help him reach that end, even if he misses out on that card.
Yeah, and that's already, we're seeing this, this high-level style of play that we're going to get all weekend here, where, bouncing a token, a food token, which can be sacrificed with the Teferi.
Mm-hmm. Right. On its face, as a micro decision, it's not necessarily the most attractive thing to do, but in a macro sense, we see it.
And now we'll see Zan on his side doing what his deck does best. Cards like Ice Fang Coatl getting cast in this matchup. These easy 2-for-1s, things that Joe can't really counter, can't counter with his cards like Force of Negation, and wouldn't want to counter even if he could.
Right, and we've seen this previously with cards like Baleful Strix, where it seems kind of incidental, but you're going to have to deal with this piece of cardboard eventually.
So Coatl draws a card, then Zan ponders, and we go to Joe. Supreme Verdict is an option. We'll see whether he does it just yet. The Teferi actually can survive another turn.
Yeah, it's tough to say what he really wants to do here. I would assume he just wants to hold for a turn.
Right, and that's what he does, because he actually can end step the Supreme Verdict.
Right, or do it mid-combat.
So back to Zan we go. A lot of Syed's creatures, or threats rather, are creatures. So he has to be wary about this end step Supreme Verdict that could come out of Joe's deck. Joe has 2 copies of Supreme Verdict this weekend.
And Syed cracking his land here indicates that he likely has a Veil of Summer in his hand. And the reason for that being relevant is if he can cast Veil of Summer before he casts a must-counter spell, then he actually gets to force that spell through.
Yeah, even with Teferi in play, Veil of Summer actually does still do something. You have to play it in a way that's a bit awkward, but it does work.
Exactly.
So Zan, it looks like, is going to start with Veil of Summer. Now, this still is a bit of a win for Joe, right? Zan doesn't get to draw a card with this Veil.
Right. The idea here, if you're in Syed's position, is that this card, even though you are discarding a card, sort of, whatever you're resolving is going to more than make up for that card.
So this means spells, keys, controls cannot be countered this turn. And this is the follow-up play. And it's Oko, Thief of Crowns. It's the one Planeswalker in Zan's deck. And it can't be countered, and it's not going to be hit by this Supreme Verdict. So overall, this feels like a win.
Right, and, this is that spot that we were kind of talking about going into the match where Lossett's deck can kind of struggle to answer these Planeswalkers.
Now, if Zan turns the Astrolabe into a 3/3, the Supreme Verdict will still play here. Plus, and it looks like he is going to... Is he elking up the Astrolabe or the Goose? Oh, this is nice.
This is a
great plays by Zan. Yeah, swings in. So he's going to lose this, but I wanted to stress how good of a play this was from Zan. I think a lot of times you would see players, especially with an Oko in play, turn the Astrolabe into an Elk.
Right, so this is a spot where Syed elected to give his Goose some antlers and started applying pressure that way. But now, if Lossett does something, Syed is going to have a sort of 3/3 haste creature in the form of this Arkham's Astrolabe that can pressure Teferi on Syed's next turn.
Yeah, he has pressure next turn as opposed to the following turn. And that was because of a really heads-up move.
And that's just such an enormous difference.
So the Supreme Verdict does hit from Joe. Creep board is clear for now. But you mentioned that Joe's deck can be weak against Planeswalkers. It's good at keeping them off the board. But once they're on the board, he's got some trouble.
Right, he's really looking for something like a Council's Judgment at this point.
Brainstorm from Joe. Yeah, I'm looking at his deck list. So we do have Swords to Plowshares for removal. Supreme Verdict. Other than that, his way to answer it, I mean, he has a 1 Teferi Hero of Dominaria that could cleanly answer an Oko.
Right, and past that, he's just hoping that his own Okos can go the distance.
Yeah, he has to attack it down. Now, he did draw an Oko this turn, so there is something to like there. But I do think we're seeing some of the difficulty now in the matchup. Joe had... Things are going according to plan. He had this Teferi. He was sitting behind Force of Negation and Dovin's Veto. But then you kind of see Zan's side with things like main deck Veil of Summer, creature-based threats, Icefang, Coatl. It's not that Joe didn't have the board presence. He just didn't have the right answers.
Exactly. And cards like Veil of Summer just are going to end up lining up well against things like Dovin's Veto.
Yeah. I mean, and how good of a card is Veil of Summer, right? This is a 1-mana counterspell that draws a card, and then it does other things. Even here, it plays even with a Teferi on the table.
Right, and it can be a protection spell. It can do all kinds of things.
Yeah, and I know if you haven't been watching Legacy since Throne of Eldraine came out, Veil of Summer in the main deck of both players, both of them with additional copies in the sideboard. This is going to change how Legacy matchups play.
Oh, absolutely.
So now Joe with an Oko of his own makes a food token. And he has to pass on Zan's side. Astrolabe swings in. Did Joe find a Swords to Plowshares? He did. Astrolabe is down, and Joe gets to keep his Planeswalker. That is a big turn of events.
Oh, yeah, this is a huge swing in Lossett's favor. Just getting to untap with this Teferi to either actually draw a card out of it or just put it out of Elk range.
Sylvan Library. Joe's last cards, are they Dovin's Veto and Force of Negation? So he has to decide here whether he's willing to dump the rest of the cards in his hand to take care of this Sylvan Library. Actually, correction. Looks like that Force of Negation was shipped away. So now we have Brainstorm and Dovin's Veto, which means there's certainly no answers for Joe.
Yeah, no, this Sylvan Library resolves.
And Brainstorm from Zan. So Joe now has control of the board, but he is certainly behind on cards in hand. Can this Oko run away with it? That'll be the question.
I mean, at this point, Lossett at least gets to pressure the Oko, which is a big deal here. And there isn't going to be anything like a mid-combat surprise Quaddle because of this Teferi.
Brainstorm from Zan, and then a Ponder. So he has not found what he likes here.
I think we see another Oko hiding out in Syed's hand.
Another Oko. I know before the Brainstorm, he had a Bitter Blossom in hand. I don't know whether it stayed there.
That's a really strong one here.
Yeah.
You thought about Bitter Blossom and Oko together?
Oh, wow. Yeah. I mean, in general, I just think in these matchups, we were talking about this in the pregame show, how to approach the blue matchup. You know, Joe has decided to approach the blue matchup, much like Joe would, with counter spells.
Sure.
Zan has tried to approach this matchup with high-impact 2-mana tap-out plays, like Sylvan Library, like Bitter Blossom. And though this game can go either way, in general, I do like Zan's approach more.
Yeah, and this is a spot where we just see Syed kind of engineering his deck to line up well in these mid-range matchups, saying, all right, I know what people are going to bring, and I know what cards those are weak against.
A land picked up here for Joe. No help there. And Teferi will put the Sylvan Library back in Zan's hand. Now, Joe with the veto can counter it on the way back down. Oko will turn the Elk into a food. Attack down the other Oko. Partway. Goes to 3. Joe picked up a very good card, actually. When he binned that Teferi, he found another Swords to Plowshares.
Yeah, and we see that land he picked up was actually a copy of Mystic Sanctuary, which represents a spell out of this deck.
Absolutely. Yeah, 1 copy of Mystic Sanctuary in Joe's deck. He has 3 islands in play, so that will trigger. Here's the library again, and I think that will earn the Dovin's Veto. It's why Joe put it back in Zan's hand. But now I have to ask, was it the test spell? Are we about to see a Bitter Blossom?
Yeah, and this is the spot where you are incentivized to just jam it, right? It's not getting better the longer your opponent gets to spin their wheels in their blue deck.
Yeah, I mean, if a Bitter Blossom hits the table here, I think it's going to be difficult for Joe to deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
And see for Syed, he's taking the time. I actually like this matchup. Both these players, I think, of our field are among the most patient players when it comes to in-game.
Oh, yeah, and a lot of that is them just really looking at the tactical side of things rather than the micro decisions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they both are players that really excel at looking at the long-term game plans, knowing what's important in a matchup, thinking about it that way, maybe is more so than thinking about the individual decisions on any one turn.
Exactly. We saw that in the early turns of the game when Lossett bounced to that food with Teferi at the cost of a card because he had a very specific plan in how he wanted his cards to play out in the matchup.
And from Joe, a big find. It's Brainstorm. His hand was running out of things to do. Nothing like a Brainstorm to help solve that problem.
Oh, yeah. Just inject some gas into your resources.
And look at the cards he has now. Force of Negation, Ponder, another Swords to Plowshares. an Oko, and then it looks like a Mystic Sanctuary, and then a Prismatic Vista.
Right, and it looks like here he's just deciding if he wants to have this Mystic Sanctuary or shuffle it away with the Prismatic Vista.
Yep. Looks like, I mean, all 6 of those cards play pretty well, so Joe is going to keep all of them.
Oh yeah, Mystic Sanctuary just represents a spell. And any spell, almost. It's a mystical tutor on a land, it feels like.
Yeah. It is, I suppose, at some level, -1 card, then.
Sure.
It's interesting, right? If he wanted to make that play, he actually had the option to put the Sanctuary in the deck, keep the Vista. No, Vista only finds basic lands, actually, so that does not work.
Well, it's not like he doesn't play Flooded Strand and Misty Rainforest to find everything else.
I was going to say, if it was another fetch land, he might put the Sanctuary back and then just fetch it off the top and get the shuffle.
Mm-hmm.
And looks like he wants Dovin's Veto back. Really wants to control the non-creature spells. But some patience here. Joe had Ponder. He could have pondered into it this turn, but wants to maximize the cantrips.
Right. And when you already have reasonable spells in your hand, you want to actually make sure you're getting something out of these cantrips. We aren't playing Ponder for the sake of 1 mana, don't shuffle, draw a card. Sometimes it works out that way, but when you know you have some lackluster cards on the top of your library because of this brainstorm, you're incentivized to just wait a turn.
I like this from Joe. He's really just trying to control... This is his game plan that he wanted. He wants to control the non-creature aspects of this matchup. So he has that Force of Negation in hand. I don't think he's going to pitch it. He's planning just to cast that.
Mm-hmm.
3 mana negate is fine. He's now starting to get a mana advantage. He has loyalty advantage on the Oko. The only thing he doesn't really have control over is that Sylvan Library.
Right, and this is, in a lot of ways, it feels like the difference between attacking cards versus attacking a strategy. It feels like Lossett has postured most of his deck with another archetype in mind, whereas Syed has postured a bunch of individual card choices with that in mind. So, if Lossett can attack those individual cards, it'll feel like he's coming out ahead in these exchanges.
Zan elks up the food token. So he's got one of his own now. He is still behind, but it's going to be Icefang Coatl. 1/1 Death Toucher here that can block, help him get back up to Elk parity. And he will pass back. It's actually interesting with how this is playing out. Oko, you see Joe's Oko is getting to 9 loyalty, going to continue going higher. The ultimate in this matchup doesn't seem like it does much.
Not necessarily, but in this case it actually has the ability to, if, say, Joe were to -5 here and give Syed an unspent or unelked food in exchange for a 3/3 elk, that could be a reasonable swing to at least get a blocker out of the way.
Now Joe, after drawing the veto, fires on the Ponder. He does not like what he sees.
Well, you have a Prismatic Vista and another Oko and a mystery card. That mystery card better be pretty good
Yes,
to have 2 blanks coming.
Yeah, second Oko doesn't seem like it's going to play in this matchup, or in this game at least. Now, for those of you watching here, you do see a clock up at the top here. We do, for day 1 here on the Players' Championship, we do have timed rounds, but they are being played because this is bracketed play using sudden death rules. So it is most game wins if we run out of time. If that is still tied, it is highest life total, and if the life totals are tied, it is first change in life total.
Here we just see Lossett with a wall of counter spells in his hand and a Swords to Plowshares that he's probably going to want to fire off to just get this Oko off the table.
Yeah, and I like that. It's an aggressive posture. He's got some extra cards. Well, actually, rather than extra cards, he is behind on cards. So the idea to create more pressure with swords here feels right.
Mm-hmm. Right. Whenever you're up on cards, a lot of times you're incentivized to just have these 1-for-1 exchanges because, let's say you're up 2 cards. 4 cards to 2 cards is far more pronounced than, say, 9 cards to 7 cards.
Right. Swings in for 6, and we see another Icefang Coatl from Zan. That's going to flash into play.
And And this is a spot where Joe may have wanted to -5 that Oko to steal the other elk, because this way you end up not taking as much damage back from Oko on the way back, depending on what Syed ends up doing.
I want to count other snow permanents. Yeah, I don't think he has. He only has 2 other snow permanents.
Ooh.
So that elk actually sticks around. You saw Joe bend it, and then Zan had to say, no, the Astrolabe's gone.
Wait a second.
Yeah. Ice Fang Coatl has Death Touch as long as you have 3 other snow permanents. Does not count itself.
Even without Wasteland in play, fetching up duels over basics is not free.
Sylvan Library from Zan. He took 2 extra cards last turn, went down to 13. So it looks like this turn he'll just take 1 card, puts the other 2 back. Gets a fetch land here, so that's a pretty nice interaction.
Mm-hmm.
And there's the one, Bitter Blossom. If Joe has a counterspell,
You pull the trigger.
Yeah. And it is Dovin's Veto. Actually, he doesn't have 1 counterspell. Joe has 3 counterspells.
Oh, well, now he has
He has
2.
Veto, Force, he has I think Force of Will and Force of Negation, his last 2 cards.
No big deal. Close game.
I do want to look back at Zan's side. He has a second main deck Veil of Summer, though, so there is something that Joe has to be concerned about.
Right, and
Yeah.
honestly, something like an Abrupt Decay could even just put Syed back in this game.
Yeah, absolutely, because Joe can't counter it.
Mm-hmm.
Zan plays 3 copies of Abrupt Decay.
Exactly, and that's just goes right back to the idea that Syed knows what he's going to be running up against and what he wants to be attacking. There's a reason that card isn't Assassin's Trophy.
Here's another Bitter Blossom. Does that get the Force out of Joe's hand? Either Force, really. No, it does not.
No?
That's a bit surprising.
Yeah, it's an interesting decision. At this point, he may just be prioritizing protecting Oko, or wanting to be in a position where he doesn't just blow both of the cards on this Bitter Blossom and then be top decking against what Syed is doing.
Top 3. 2 Force of Wills and a land. Joe will say no. Yeah, I do agree that I don't like being empty-handed from Joe's spot. At the same time, Bitter Blossom feels like a tough one to beat.
Bitter Blossom's definitely a big one.
And Astrolabe from Joe. Now his hand is those 2 counterspells and a land. Still no help.
Lots of wheel spinning here.
Yeah, he can play that land, and that allows him to hard cast the Force of Will, but can't imagine he's too excited about that.
Right, his line here is likely just looking at pressuring Oko and then trying to go upstairs to Syed's life total and possibly even race a Bitter Blossom. Oko is going to end up lining up well heads up against Bitter Blossom.
Hold on, did Joe just go to the life total? Did that elk ignore Oko? It did.
Ooh.
That is a sign of panic on Joe's side.
Oh, yeah.
Like, yeah, those cantrips did not find me a good card.
Right.
We're going upstairs. Another Coatl, and that's still... Okay, it's draws card. Still doesn't have Death Touch from Zan. That is his 4th Ice Fang Coatl of the game. But yeah, Joe out of resources. Bitter Blossom will send Zan down to 9. But this is where I think the, food tokens, which generally are just textless artifacts, now might start to matter, right?
Right, it's very hard to actually just race somebody who is gaining 3 life a turn when they're only paying 1 life a turn.
Yeah, I mean, look at this engine, right? Zan has these Sylvan Libraries, these Bitter Blossoms, these cards that would make you think, yeah, I'm going to run out of life points, except Oko just takes care of that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's starting, this matchup to me is starting to remind me, if you want to go back where people have been playing Legacy for a while, when you used to see Stoneblade versus Shardless Sultai, where the Stoneblade decks would do these good things, play these nice 2-for-1s, these powerful cards, and then Shardless Sultai would just say 2-for-1, 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 and then eventually they'd run the other player out of cards. That feels like what I'm watching here.
Right, and, we see Syed picking up a copy of Leovold here. If Lossett doesn't pull the trigger on Force of Will here, I would be shocked.
Right.
This feels like the final piece.
Yeah, and you go reaches right for the fetch land. There's just no way.
Exactly.
I mean, I suppose he could trade for the Leovold. If he wanted to let it resolve, he could try to make that work.
That's true.
It would get traded for back.
Exactly.
But But yeah, there's this issue where Zan's entire deck is 2-for-1s, and Joe is just going to run out of cards.
Right, and that's a lot of why we saw Joe not pulling the trigger on the 2-for-1 forces earlier in the game, is he recognizes that you can't always make those -1 plays when your opponent is going to be coming out ahead in so many of your exchanges already.
So it's countered by Joe. Now we go to Zan. Oko pluses to Elk, the fairy token. And you notice how he's making the fairy token a 3/3 and not the food token.
Correct.
And there's the removal spell Assassin's Trophy on Oko.
And this is a huge swing in Syed's favor. At this point, it just kind of feels like Lossett's running out of gas here.
Yeah, I mean, he absolutely is. He's running out of cards. And because Zan has Bitter Blossom and Sylvan Library, it's just not... He can't run out of cards.
Right. You know, there are 3 different pieces here that are keeping Syed in this game. This feels very similar to the Jeskai Planeswalker deck that they played in Standard, where getting to untap with any of these makes it a close game, but getting to untap with multiples just puts it out of reach.
And Joe was really far ahead at one point in this game, which I want to go back to. We talk about the differences in the decks. When Joe was ahead, what he did is he used his advantage to draw a lot of counter spells, a lot of Dovin's Vetoes, a lot of Force and Negations. That didn't really work. Now we get to see what Zan's deck does when he's ahead. When Zan's ahead, he casts Sylvan Libraries and Bitter Blossoms, and he just buries the game with them. And that's why on paper it just seems like he's made so much of a better choice for this.
Right, and there's certainly a point where strategically Lossett may be trying to lean into things that line up well in these mid-range decks, but there's a point where Syed's just kind of playing with a bunch of hammers, and how many must-counter spells can you actually counter?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, Joe actually doesn't have that many counter spells. You know, his cards like Teferi Time Raveler are good in Blue Mirrors, but they're not good against Bitter Blossoms and Sylvan Libraries.
Right.
And at this point, the question is, what kind of draw spell can Joe have to get back in this? Unlike some other players, he has not registered accumulated knowledge for this tournament, something that could draw him, a fresh 7.
Right, even just catching up to this Oko on the battlefield is such a tall order.
Do appreciate the fight. He knocks Zan down to 6, soon to be 5. Swords away the token, but actually, wait, Zan gained 3 when he swords away the token, so at 7. And now gained 3 to go up to 10. So it's treading water.
Yeah, this is a spot where we can see what Lossett is doing, but there's only a 3/3 now, right? He doesn't have the same pressure that a long-lasting Oko was giving him previously.
And yeah, and look how quickly Zan is going to rebuild. He had a token off Bitter Blossom, down to 9. Sylvan Library here, 3 cards to look at. Could even take one of them. Right,
this almost just feels like a free brainstorm every turn in a lot of respects. Maybe not quite at that power level, but when it's free and it's every turn, how much worse is it really?
And we see Gilded Goose. Another card, generally a mana creature is bad to turn on the late game, except when your life total is under this kind of pressure. That's not the case. These food tokens are great.
Right, and this even feels not entirely different than the situation that we would see back when Deathrite Shaman was legal, where even if this is a mana creature in the late stages of the game, it is also a bit of a resource engine that now that Life Total is trying to put an emphasis on life totals, Gilded Goose is just fine.
Right, it's funny, 2 months ago, people started putting Gilded Goose in their modern decks, and players were ribbing them for it. We're talking saying, oh man, I don't want to play that crappy standard card in my modern deck. And now, surprise, it's in legacy decks.
Yeah.
It's actually just great.
Yeah, exactly. Do you remember that time that Jerry Thompson started putting Deathrite Shaman in his legacy deck and won an invitational?
Yeah.
You got to think outside of the box to make it far in these high-stakes events.
Real question. Better or worse than Noble Hierarch?
Oh, don't make me do this.
I know you don't want... you don't want the answer. Yeah.
Yeah, look, I'm going to say Noble Hierarch because I love her, but it's not a fair fight, and we'll leave it at that.
I certainly think if you ask better or worse than Birds of Paradise, that one's not close.
Oh, correct. So we see a flashback Ponder via Snapcaster Mage, and I see an Oko up in those top cards. And, if he shuffles that away, what is he looking for? I'm just not even...
So yeah, let's look at the deck list, right? Because Oko doesn't actually do it. I mean, and this is the hard part, right? I would normally say the second Supreme Verdict, but I don't think so.
Right. At that point, you're just kind of resetting the battlefield, which is... It's a tough sell to convince me that favors you against the Bitter Blossom Oko Sylvan Library battlefield.
I guess what I would say is Jace the Mind Sculptor is the card he's digging for, because it lets him dig for more cards.
Right. That just sort of presents a layer of threat similar to what Syed is presenting here.
The concern would be that Joe only has about 1 or 2 more turns to cast Jace, because once Zan has too many fairy tokens, a Jace off the top won't do anything.
Right.
It will brainstorm once and then hit the graveyard. So Oko is the keep, second Elk, 8 power here. He's got to try to pressure this life total, but because Zan has Goose and Oko and a lot of mana, if it gets too close, if Zan starts getting close to 0, he has options.
And the worst part is here, he's kind of obligated just to pass back now that Syed's copy of Oko is in ultimate range. If Lossett doesn't leave enough blockers back, then Syed can just make a food with the Goose, give the Goose the fresh food to Lossett, and take whatever Lossett's last blocker is away, and then wipe out Lossett's card advantage engine.
And again, I want to talk about the macro of each of these players. On Zan's side, he's recognized what's happening in this game. And you look at life totals, and you notice how just completely unconcerned with life totals Zan is.
Oh, yeah. He'll get around to winning. And the idea is with Bitter Blossom and Oko, you'll never die to your Bitter Blossom. That problem just isn't even on the table.
He'll win when Joe's out of... At some point, Joe will be out of permanence, and then that's how Zan's going to win.
Right. And with the configuration of Lossett's deck, in a lot of ways, this Bitter Blossom Oko situation almost just feels like a free 1/1 Planeswalker emblem.
Yeah. Just makes a 1/1 every turn.
Right. And that's just such a tall order for any of the blue-white based control decks to slog through.
Yeah, there's nothing like planar cleansing that Joe can do to mop this up. And that wouldn't be a card we'd see in Legacy. I'm trying to think if there's other, Legacy costed cards that just kill everything.
Well, maybe Reverent Silence?
Yeah, maybe something like that.
That's green. I'm thinking of Purity.
Right, something that wipes the enchantments.
Yes. Or is Purity the thing from Lorwyn?
Tempest of Light does that. There are...
Serenity. Final answer. Yeah. Lock it in.
Yeah, Purity is the Vigor cycle card.
Yeah. I knew it was one of those very, very wholesomely named white cards.
The Elks trade.
And, looking back a few turns ago, when Lossett was making these exchanges, he liked it because he was ahead. But now that he's behind, he is really unhappy to be having to exchange material like that.
And I wonder if that'll start affecting how Joe has to play this matchup. Even when because Zan has so much more value, I'm not even sure how much Joe should be trading when he's ahead. Just in general, you mentioned before that when you're up 4 cards to 2, you want to make it 2 cards to 0. You want to trade it down.
Right.
But I don't know, based on how I've seen this play out, if that's exactly the math Joe wants to be doing. Because at 2 cards to 0, Zan's going to catch up to him in 4 turns.
Correct. There's a point where Syed's higher, honestly just density of 2-for-1s, it runs a higher risk of top decking out of that sort of situation than Lossett does.
Yeah, I think the way you think about it is, right, at 2 cards to 0 is that every turn cycle, Joe is losing... 0.4 cards on Zan or something, like some fraction of a card every turn he's going behind by that much. So if he actually has to do damage, what he has to think then is, how many cards do I need to get my opponent to 0? And if he's up 4-2, maybe he needs to keep all 4 of his cards because that is enough attackers to deal damage, and 2 cards isn't. Right. So he has to actually avoid trades.
Right, so maybe just creating a situation where, say, Swords to Plowshares can give him an opening on an otherwise clogged battlefield.
Right, something like
that. Is it more of an avenue to victory than getting down to 2 elks to 1 elk?
I think so. I think that's how I would look at it. When you are behind on this resource thing, you want to make the game high variance. You don't want 1 elk to 0. You want 5 elks to 3 elks.
Right.
And they say, okay, well, if I one big turn can sweep away your blockers. I can 15 you, and maybe that's enough.
Right, that feels completely valid here. And, so something we haven't really touched on that I think we really want to bring up here, we see Syed at 6 life. Pressuring Syed's life total has also hurt the efficacy of Sylvan Library. Zan cannot pay life to draw extra cards on this, so if he wants to clear his Sylvan Library, he's either going to have to waste a draw on a fetch land or pay a very significant chunk of his life total.
Yeah, now, he still has the option with Gilded Goose and Oko. I feel like you're right, but at the same time, I'm just not concerned if Zan's going to go to 0 on these life points, right? He can just start cracking food if it really comes to that.
Sure, but he still wants to be able to develop on the battlefield, and it's not free to crack that food.
How do you feel right now about looking at the format of this tournament? Joe is deciding to still contest this game. So remember, our rules are, if they reach the end of the round, and I don't think we're going to get 3 games done in this round. It's most games won, and if it is 1-1 in games, then it's highest life total.
Well, it may be that Joe is trying to win highest life total here.
So you think like he wants to 0 games complete?
It's possible that that's what he's leaning into here. Or he just isn't confident that he can finish a post-board game.
That's the interesting part, right? Because I think if you're trying to make a 0-0 win on Joe's side, hanging on for another 22 minutes on this battlefield, to me, seems hard.
Sure, and a lot of that's going to come down to, do you think it is more likely that you can hold on for 20 minutes in this, or that you can win games 2 and 3 in, say, 20 total minutes?
Right. Well, you have to win game 2 and then just be up on the tiebreak in game 3.
Do you want to risk being up in life total against the Gilded Goose deck?
Well, they are also the Bitter Blossom deck, so it's a real interesting matchup.
Well, the thing is...
they don't have to cast it.
Yeah, upside is very different than downside.
Yeah.
Especially when, say, there's 4 minutes left on the clock and they get to sideboard for game 3. All of a sudden... Syed has Gilded Goose and Icefang Quaddle in his deck.
So back to Zan we go. The Elk swings in. He's really snowballed his advantage on this board. Now, it hasn't gotten into any big gains yet, right? The Planeswalkers are still there. The life total hasn't been dented. But I think we're getting to the point where the Jode's board's going to start clearing.
Oh, right. Lossett only has 1 Supreme Verdict left to mop up these fairies, and we're really getting to the point where Syed just has so much material that he can send into the red zone that Planeswalkers aren't going to be effective anymore.
He is down to 5, but we see 1 food token at the ready. Goose is there on end step.
Lining up that Verdict mana.
Well, here's Jace. On Zan's side, I think he just let it happen. I mean, you can tack it down.
Yeah, and if this is the way for Lossett to get back into this game.
Yeah, I wonder if this was it. If this is too late. The question is whether he can defend it. The thing about Joe's list is he doesn't have any haymaker threats. Sometimes you'll see a fair deck play something like a True Name Nemesis, for example, here. Or something like that. If Joe had something like that to draw to, we'd be telling a different story right now. Right.
Joe's entire plan leans on the idea that his deck has inevitability between cards like Jace, Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, and so on. And against Zan, that just isn't always going to be the case.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing here is that Joe doesn't have inevitability.
Right.
Another food token from Oko. He still has some counter magic in his hand.
He also has an Icefang Quaddle hanging out.
Okay, and the Astrolabe can cast it.
Right.
You see Zan finally starts to go and eat some of those food tokens.
And we saw before Syed wastelanded Lossett's copy of Tropical Island, which made it so Lossett cannot elk this copy of Astrolabe to create an extra blocker here.
Top 3 from Syed. Three fairy tokens have now joined the battle. Can elk up a food token. It's gotta chip away at these planeswalkers.
Hard to imagine Syed doesn't just send everything at Jace here.
I mean, he can get greedy, right? He can send the Elk at Jace and all the fairies at Teferi if he wants, something like that, but...
You could, but it feels like Jace is really the thing here that could let Lossett stay in the game.
And that's exactly what Zan does. Zan is under no time pressure here.
Exactly.
Jace is the threatening planeswalker. Just make sure it's really dead.
Mm-hmm.
Move on. And Joe will cast Ice Fang Coatl of his own. 1/1 flyers, though, against a Bitter Blossom opponent can be a bit underwhelming.
There's a point here where Joe may be interested in trying to minus Oko in order to just try and steal Zan's Gilded Goose.
The goose is actually pretty important. You mean just so that Zan can't gain life anymore?
Correct.
It's interesting. Now, then you get in this weird spot where Zan has his own Oko and can take it back. But I do like it.
Right.
Maybe that exchange is fine for Joe.
Well, there's that Supreme Verdict off of a Brainstorm here. So, Lossett has found his way to catch up a little bit.
I like Supreme Verdict here. I mean, you mentioned Gilded Goose. That life gain that it represents is being really important here.
You look at this. If we see a main phase Supreme Verdict,
all right.
Elk, the Astrolabe that is not summoning sick, can attack for 3.
You're getting, it's
Lossett's
getting close.
Getting close here.
Zan will certainly gain life with the goose before it goes away.
Correct.
Yeah, but maybe that's enough. Maybe Joe can find an avenue to get those last points of damage. Rolling up the sleeves a little bit. Gonna send some creatures, perhaps. Here's another food token.
All right, so this is telegraphing to me an in-step copy or mid-combat copy of Supreme Verdict.
Yeah, and Joe actually has Veil of Summer in his hand as well. It's his one main deck copy. I like this. I think Joe may have found a spot where he can get some damage done.
Oh, this is the way that it happens. You have to be able to pick your spots to really maximize the value of your cards.
It's another fairy token for Zan. His own Veil of Summer. It's his second copy and a Force of Will. And I'm interested actually in Legacy, if this is what these Legacy matchups are going to be like. I guess it's why we're seeing players with cards like main deck Veil of Summer. So, 4 fairy tokens. Now, thanks to that Teferi Plus, Joe can come in with this Supreme Verdict at instant speed. And they will say, yeah, that land should be untapped. Here's an attack for 4. Make it for 7. Probably just going at Planeswalkers, though.
And this is nice. We haven't seen an activation of Oko yet, which means that if Lossett does have the Verdict, Syed will be able to create a blocker post-combat.
That is a good heads-up play by Zan to not push extra with the Oko, and Joe does cast the Supreme Verdict. Zan makes another food token in response. Fairies are gone. That goose is gone too. They'll clean that up in a second here. Now we go to Zan's second main. He is at 6. But you're right, Oko has not been used. And Joe with some potential to push damage, right? He has Teferi -3 to bounce away a blocker. He has an Oko to make an Elk.
Is there even a spot where he could bounce the Bitter Blossom with Teferi?
He can do that. And we see Oko, Elks up an Astrolabe as a blocker. Noble Hierarchan. Zan's being very cautious with his life total here.
Oh, right. At this point, Syed has got to realize he has the inevitability. He just needs to get more turns, and eventually that will be good enough.
Does Joe want to bounce the Bitter Blossom is the question. Right,
So,
this is because it's kind of his avenue for winning, isn't it?
that's true. I also see he has another copy of Teferi in his hand, it looks like, so that could just get both of these blockers out of the way.
So you bounce a blocker, make an Elk, swing 3. You're getting there. This is really interesting. That kind of play is so value negative, though, you know?
That's true.
You're bouncing an Astrolabe, you're bouncing a 1-drop. There's still 2 food in play. So Zan is kind of at 12. I'm not sure I want to go for the kill just yet.
That's true. And there's so much going on in this battlefield.
Right. All right, so Teferi. Joe does have another one, so maybe this This one can go. I mean, the question is then, if you're not going to bounce a blocker, you probably are going to try to pick up and counter one of these enchantments on the way back down. Which one do you do it to?
It's a tough call, honestly.
Yeah, I think so. I think this is it. Zan has too many life points still. So he chooses to take care of that Bitter Blossom.
Big pickup from Lossett off the top here.
Another Teferi. Force of Will, hard cast from Zan, but Joe has Veil of Summer. The old 1-mana counter draw a card.
Love a good cryptic command.
That's a good card. And Teferi will resolve. This is a big swing here for Joe.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And looking like we are going to have that one-game match here. Both players, Joe deciding to dig in to try to win game one. And he's really making a show of it.
Holding on for that 20 minutes.
Yeah. This might be more than holding on. He's going for the win now.
He's turning it around.
And might just have done it. Two counter spells plus a Teferi in play. This will be very difficult for Zan to make much headway.
Right. At this point, it kind of just feels like it's Oko versus Oko and Teferi.
Yeah, maybe it's best for Zan. Zan picking up Veil of Summer, but again, there's a Teferi in play, so that Veil doesn't really work how we'd like it to.
Right. He's not going to get to draw the card off of it. He can preempt the Bitter Blossom, though, like we saw earlier in the match, so it's not completely dead.
Right. I mean, there's things he can do, right? He can Exalted attack this Elk into Teferi Time Raveler, which means Joe will have to start chump blocking, or lose his Teferi.
Is that even that bad of a place to be?
Well, it means that the Veil of Summer's online again.
Sure. I mean, you can just throw your Elk under the bus.
Yeah, that's probably what Joe does.
Yeah.
Another Elk made here by Oko.
That was a full ultimate.
That was a steal of the blocker. Okay, I like this.
Yeah, no, this is great.
So then it's attack with Exalted. You think you get rid of the Teferi?
Right, yeah. I mean, it's that or knock Oko down to, 8?
All right. Well, given those, we can put it that way.
Or Joe down to a measly 12.
With 2 food tokens in play. Yeah, Zan, after drawing that Veil of Summer, wants to enable it. So here's the swing, and Teferi is gone. So Zan will get his Veil. Now, Joe has another Teferi, so it might just be that Zan cycles Veil of Summer. It might not be any better than that. But here's Bitter Blossom. Force of Negation. I think we're going to see Veil of Summer here. Yeah, Zan with his own counter draw card for 1.
All right, first Legacy counterfight coming up.
And the hard part, remember, if this Veil resolves, Zan's next spell is also uncounterable.
Right.
Veil of Summer, a powerhouse in these counter wars, and it looks like that's just going to happen. So Bitter Blossom resolves. What else would Zan like to resolve? His spells are now all uncounterable.
That's a big message from Lossett here.
Well, the good news for Joe is that Zan did not have anything else to cast that turn. But now both players are out of Veil of Summers. And a Ponder from Joe. There's a ton of back and forth here. And a Shuffle from Joe. I'm looking at his deck to see what he even has left. So he hasn't used a second Jace.
Snapcaster Mage?
He's got 1 Snapcaster left, right?
Yes.
1 Snapcaster left, 1 Jace left, and he still has that 1 Teferi Hero of Dominaria, though...
He has the Teferi in his hand.
Okay.
It looks like he's trying to pave the way for it.
It's hard, right? Because Bitter Blossom is just a pretty good card against Planeswalkers.
Mm-hmm.
There's only a couple of Planeswalkers that match up well against it, and Joe doesn't have any of them. So here is Hero of Dominaria. It's his other Teferi. It's going to resolve. And Joe goes to work with the plus. This one will just draw him a card every turn. Here's Brainstorm.
That's a good one to draw.
Force of Will picked up, some lands picked up. And is Joe scooping?
I believe that is a concession.
Now that's really interesting on Joe's side. So with 850 remaining, what do you make of this? So he's He played it all the way down to the 8-minute mark, and after sideboarding, it's probably going to be, 5 minutes?
Right, so here it feels like he realized now that he had let this Bitter Blossom resolve and rolled up a Teferi that he could not save.
So the Teferi was dead next turn?
It was effectively dead the following turn to Oko. And
so he can't win.
Right, there's no more Supreme Verdict. There is no more Teferi. That was it. He's out of ways to win the game. And
he can't play for the life total draw.
Exactly.
0-0. You just don't think he can get there?
If there were, say, 30 seconds on the clock, then there's a world where that is possible. But with 8 minutes, not really.
So they're going to play a game with 5 minutes. Now, Joe needs to win this game. And I have a concern here because Joe's sideboard has no creatures in it.
No, he is really, this is more of the same from him. He's trying to tune his game one plan for specific matchups.
Joe is not the type of player to play transformational sideboards. That is not Joe Lossett magic.
No, he has a plan. The plan's good, right? If it was a bad plan, he wouldn't have registered it.
He's practiced the plan for infinite hours.
Exactly.
And
plan's good. We stick to the plan.
It does, in this kind of situation, hurt him that he has no other way to play. Because of the time constraint, he needs to make his deck do something that it doesn't want to do.
Right, and this is a spot where he wants to be the control here, but he is just incentivized so heavily to be the aggressor that he's going to actually struggle to close the game out in 7 minutes.
Right, because he has to win this game. It's not just give it a higher lift, so he has to win. So what are we looking at then? I mean, Snapcaster beats Ice Vein Coatl,
Oko can close a game.
Oko. So Oko is the card.
Oko is the big one here, having something with, say, Astrolabes and Oko as well, because the Astrolabes allow you to actually just create Elks every turn rather than every other turn.
Right.
That's going to be big for him here. That's his best avenue, or at least most reliable avenue, to winning a game of Magic in 5 or 6 minutes.
So this one heading down to the wire. Now, this is Group A. For those of you joining us here, Legacy Group, it's Joe Lossett, Abe Corrigan, Zan Syed, and Oliver Tomiko in a group here. So it'll be a full round robin of those players for the morning rounds.
What a pod. Right?
It's one. I think of the 4 pods. This is
got to
be
the pod, right? This is you and I's favorite to win the tournament, the current reigning Players Champion, the Player of the Year, and then the first player to punch their ticket on points this year.
And I do want to talk about Zan. I think, and we have this in an article coming out today where we talked about kind of the strengths of each of the players. We did some power rankings. If you want to check that one out at StarCityGames.com. Zan, I think, is one of the sleepers here in this tournament.
Right, and it's very, very exploitable, which is his calling card. That's what Syed does.
I think there's a couple great things Zan has going here. First of all, you talk about metagaming. So each of these players is good for different reasons. You know, Joe is meticulous. Joe is thorough. Zan is an excellent metagamer. So first of all, that is incredible for a small field tournament. Second of all, so let's talk about that first. But the other thing also is I want to talk about general, how these players play. And this is a very mentally difficult tournament because it is playing 10 consecutive high-pressure matches, coming back the next day, doing the same thing again and doing it again. And I just want to talk about when we've talked with these players between rounds and how they play in top 8 matches. Zan has a very good mental game for this kind of marathon of high-pressure matches.
Right. I honestly just kind of think that all of the teams, all the players who are grinding and have been grinding the whole year are going to have a bit of an edge over the other players who have maybe spiked something to get here. Not to say that they're technically better at Magic, but Zan's been playing 10 hours of Magic every weekend this year. Look at how many even invitational qualifiers he went to grind points.
Yeah.
He's been on this grind. This is for him. This is a day at the office.
Yeah, it's in your right because at this event you can't play every match like it's your elimination match. You can't stay amped up for 3 straight days like that.
Right.
But at the same time, if you don't play tight, then maybe it is an elimination match, right? There's some players here that are going to go home today.
Right. And he's definitely the type of player where he is cool and he is calculated, even under pressure, and that's just a great formula.
So Joe keeping on 6 here. Looks like a scry to the bottom. He's chosen to play, and we'll start with Ponder. So the card you're looking for, Oko?
Yeah,
it's got to be, right?
Really, it looks like he even mulliganed a little bit here, just trying to find anything that can attack.
Yeah, 3:45 in the match. Joe needs to win this game. And we see Carpet of Flowers from Zan. This is out of his sideboard. It's a 2 of. During his main phase, he gets X mana of any one color, where X is the number of islands target opponent controls. So that'll help him cast Ponder. This is a big mana advantage in these mirrors.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And we saw just how many ways Syed had to use his mana last game, right? Before we were kind of talking about having to invest some amount of time into cracking things like food, but that's just not even a thing when you have this on the battlefield.
Zan never ran out of cards.
Exactly.
You know, especially with things like Gilded Goose, there are extra mana sinks too.
Yes.
Look at Joe. I don't think he found Prismatic Vista. I don't see an Oko in hand. And there's concern for that. On Zan's side, you just don't have to do much here, right?
Right. I see an Ice Fang Quaddle hanging out in Lossette's hand, so you're just kind of digging a little bit.
And for Zan, 1 mana. Sylvan Library using the Carpet of Flowers. This is a tough matchup for Joe.
Yeah, and you know, on the bright side, Sylvan Library is not a staying alive card.
Right.
And those are the things that Lossett is afraid of. So Bitter Blossom on its face might sound like it would be good for Lossett because of that life loss here, but when you're starting at 20, it's just generating blockers. That being said, something like Sylvan Library, you know, we're putting a bunch of emphasis on Lossett needing to win this game.
Right.
Syed can also just win this game.
Right. Ice Fang Quaddle from Joe. 2 minutes remaining. Draws a sideboard red elemental blast. Swings in for 1.
Oh.
Red Blast, Snapcaster, Jace, and Brainstorm is Joe's hand. And we're just going to see Snapcaster, and it looks like he's going to Snapcast that Ponder. I like it. It's put pressure.
Digging.
It's pressure on the board. It's a 2-1.
Yes.
This is the best he can do.
Right, this isn't something. It's not attractive, but you just have to make these plays in these sorts of situations. He has 90 seconds to win the game.
Right, and that's in play. And even then, it's going to be hard with this 3 power to get enough damage in. All it's going to take is a few removal spells from Zan.
All right, Flusterstorm
on Ponder. Nice. Okay.
Syed smells blood in the water.
Yeah, he just needs to make the game go a few turns longer, and he should be fine.
There's that Bitter Blossom.
There's a Bitter Blossom. It's, you know, yes, it reduces Zan's life total, but he's against a board of X1s. You know, I can't imagine he doesn't want to just grab that card.
Right, exactly. That's just the best card here. It keeps him alive. It answers what's on the table.
Joe has 2 tapped islands as well. Zan's even going to pay 4 life here to get an extra card.
It's just good math. You know he's comfortable when he's in the position that he is, right? Just playing to not die and still says, you know what? What the hey, let's pay for.
And this is going to about bring us to time in the round. Uses Carpet of Flowers mana. That's going to cast the Bitter Blossom. Still has 3 up. And Joe was able to make a stab at this game, but it really was about game 1 here.
Right. It was just such a long, drawn-out affair.
And time is called.